So welcome everyone again. So as I said, we're starting a new series on mindfulness and the Dharma and dealing with anxiety. So it's a 4-part series at this point, but it could likely evolve into more parts. The goal is to, if you want to use the word goal, to develop a mindfulness practice and work through kind of a 3-step process that will help you notice your anxiety habits and replace them with new healthy habits. So the first one, which we'll explore today, is really looking at identifying our anxiety habit loops, and that's what we'll be spending the most of the session today on. Next week, we'll be looking at how bringing curiosity to anxiety helps us see these habit loops more clearly. And then the third one, we're looking at what's called the bigger and better offer. How we can make sustainable habit changes. And then the third is what we do when things get overwhelming. I'm calling that one rebooting your brain. When your prefrontal cortex shuts down because a state of panic arises. That's how I'm defining overwhelming. What kinds of practices can help us. So that's basically what we're getting into. I'm basically pilot testing this with you folks. The goal is to offer this more widely after I've offered it with you folks and gotten some feedback. It's more perhaps less dharmic, you could say, than what we're used to in this group in terms of drawing. The teachings of the Buddha form the foundation of it, but I don't go into the teachings in the same way that we often do. But you'll see the Four Noble Truths buried throughout there. Seeing how suffering arises and seeing new ways to relate to our experience that can give rise to the cessation of suffering. And clinging to a self that we just went through the 5 aggregates. How that also brings rise to anxiety and suffering. So all those we've explored this in so many different ways. This is just kind of bringing this I guess you could say, more of from the mindfulness perspective to the notion of habits and looking at anxiety as a habit. So we're going to explore here how anxiety has become a habit for many of us and how mindfulness can help us break the anxiety habit loop. So I'm calling it a kind of a loop, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So anxiety, you could say, is fueled by fear plus uncertainty, right? So anxiety arises when the prefrontal cortex, the more recently evolved part of our brain, it does not have enough information to accurately predict the future. So it's searching can search for this information. In fact, it can lead to panic if the brain, the prefrontal cortex, can't find the information and anxiety starts to deepen. The prefrontal cortex can actually go offline due to as panic arises. And I'll talk more about that in week 4. So fear is necessary, right? It's natural, it's necessary, it's part of, it evolved in us as a survival instinct. It developed to help ensure our survival, right? We wouldn't be here without the fear response. It's developed evolutionarily as we got chased by saber-toothed tigers. It was the fear response. So fear helps us avoid dangerous situations. And so that's, I mean, it's natural, it's necessary. So it's not something we can actually stop from happening, nor would we really want to. It's useful, still useful today. You know, for example, if you may not be getting chased by saber-toothed tigers, but if you step out onto the road in front of a car that's speeding down the road, the fear is very useful. It's going to kick in a response where you instinctively jump back out of the way, right? If you relied on your prefrontal cortex to analyze the situation and calculate the all the dimensions of the situation, you'd get run over before you reacted quick enough. So fear gives you that immediate, instinctive, you could say, response. So fear by itself doesn't cause anxiety. And, you hear a lot of talks out there where they're talking about overcoming your fear and this kind of thing. Really, it's more about looking at how we create anxiety. Um, Fear is useful, anxiety is not useful. But for the most part, anxiety has become a habit for most of us. It's really become a habit. So, so we've developed this. I've mentioned the prefrontal cortex. I'll just go into a little bit of this, 30 seconds. Bear with me on this part. There's a prefrontal cortex. It's a layer that's on top of the more primitive or brain, the survival brain. It's sometimes called. So this prefrontal cortex helps us plan for the future. It does our the thinking and creativity, and it tries to predict what's going to happen in the future by looking at what's happened based on past experiences and running simulations, you could say, about what might happen in the future. So it's always looking for information in order to make as accurate a prediction as it can about what might happen in the future. And this is where anxiety comes in. So anxiety is kind of based on worry, um, unease about something that has an uncertain outcome, an event in the future with an uncertain outcome. It comes when our prefrontal cortex doesn't have enough information to accurately predict the future. And we see this right now with the coronavirus. Without enough information, our brains can spin stories of fear, worry, and it's almost endlessly search for additional information. And as I said before, when anxiety becomes overwhelming, it can lead to panic when anxiety deepens. And panic is just this uncontrollable anxiety that causes the thinking brain to go offline, to be literally shut down. When we're overwhelmed by anxiety, the future, our prefrontal cortex goes offline. So when this happens, of course, we're less equipped to deal with whatever might be arising. So the key part of panic is to bring the prefrontal cortex back online, and that's what we'll be looking at in week 4, and how to do that skillfully using different mindfulness and meditation techniques. So what I really want to dive into today is how we get to know these anxiety loops. And that's why the meditation that we did was so focused so much on the present moment, and why meditation really helps us do this work, because in meditation we're practicing being in the present moment, right? I mean, we've discussed the research here, how 50% of the time we're not in the present moment, we're thinking about the future or the past, right? The study where people entered in on their phones what they were thinking about while they were doing something, and I think it's like 47% of the time we're present with what we're doing, and the rest of the time our minds are elsewhere. So that the ability to be present for what's arising allows us to see our life unfolding, to see what's happening right now in the present moment. Not waiting until, geez, anxiety, a full-blown anxiety or even panic arises. We're seeing things as they're unfolding much earlier on. And this allows us to interrupt the anxiety loop, right? By being present for it in this way. So to interrupt the cycle of anxiety, we're going to go through these 3 steps. And today we're going to talk more about the first step, and then at the end you actually have to get a homework assignment or a home practice. You get a worksheet and a practice to help you uncover your anxiety loops. So the first step is becoming aware, uncovering, mapping out, you could say, your anxiety habits or anxiety habit loops. So really mapping those out. And I'll talk a lot more about what that means. The second step is you look at and know the result of this anxiety pattern loop. You start to see what happens as a result of it. What happens next. And the third is making what psychologists call a bigger and better offer. This comes from behavioral psychology, by replacing a stressful reward, which is part of the anxiety loop, with a more positive and healthy reward. And I don't know if you read, the psychology literature that's around right now, but behavioral science and psychology, it's making a comeback. It's like the 1970s for me all over again, with obviously more knowledge involved, but we've kind of gone from cognitive therapies back to behavioral. But what's interesting is how mindfulness can be folded into this, because the Buddha talked about seeing how we create suffering for ourselves in the second noble truth, right? Through this cycle of craving and clinging, and how that there's a path out of this once we see how we're creating it. So we can see firsthand what the suffering, the dukkha, feels like. And we can also, when we're aware, see when we let go of craving and clinging, what that feels like. So in a way, you're behaviorally showing yourself that non-suffering is preferable to suffering, and that would change your behavior so that you're more apt to be present for your experience. So there's these really cool similarities that I kind of noticed as I was working with some of the behavioral science stuff. So first off, we map our anxiety habit loops. That's what we want to, the first step. And we don't want to sort of skip over this and think, I know what those are. It's very important that we pay attention throughout our days and really look and map out what are kind of top anxiety loops in our lives that cause us problems. I did this for the last week, and I'll share a couple of them with you. Worrying about the future is a common anxiety habit loop. Smoking, drinking, eating are other common ones. And they're often ways to deal with anxiety that's arising, or some kind of stress or unease. But those are also, we can also map out those kinds of habit loops as they relate to anxiety. So I'll give you some examples of those 3 steps playing out, just to make it a little clearer. So example 1 is fear of catching COVID comes up, right? Fear of catching COVID. So our habit pattern might be to pick up our device and do a Google search and begin reading the kind of tidal wave of information that's out there, much of it contradictory. It can become confusing, and this makes us feel worse. And it could get so bad that panic could actually arise for us, in which case the prefrontal cortex goes offline, and we have no ability in that case to deal with the situation. And we can't suppress this or think our way out of it. So what do? So with this practice, we can map out the habit loop that's taking place. And we might notice what we would notice what the brain is doing here. So we could notice and we could put down our device because we know that this is a loop that creates anxiety and carry on. We might, so pause in this case could become our new habit. And when we pause, new options might emerge. And of course, if panic had set in, the pause will allow the prefrontal cortex to come back online. And perhaps we call a friend who's a virologist that we know and ask some questions from somebody like that, and perhaps find an information source from that person that we could go to in the future. And we notice how this makes us feel when we relate to it in this way. Perhaps we notice, instead of anxiety, we notice calm, we feel calm, and we can really sense into that calm. So that's the new loop in a sense. When we experience calm rather than anxiety, our brains are going to move towards that bigger and better offer, right? Our brains are going to naturally want to feel, freedom or calm instead of dukkha and anxiety. Another example, you wake up in the middle of the night, or perhaps just lying down to go to sleep. It works either way. And you start worrying about a situation of some kind, a situation at work or a relationship, some situation that's there. You start worrying about it. So our habit loop might be to lay in bed thinking about a way to fix it, perhaps blaming events on particular people. So we see how, and then that causes more anxiety, causes us not to be able to go to sleep. And that's a identifiable habit loop that we can actually map out. With this, once we see that habit loop, we can again we can see it, make a bigger and better offer. We can see what our brain is doing, and we can decide to do something else. Perhaps we have some techniques that can help us ground ourselves, belly breathing, or other techniques that ways that we can relate to these kinds of spinning thoughts. So once again, we've experienced calm rather than anxiety, and our brains will move towards that bigger and better offer. Hmm. Hmm. Okay. I'm looking at an old copy of the file here. I was looking for the newer one. Okay, I'll have to wing it a bit. So the homework, the home practice is to map out our anxiety habit loops. And the way you map it out is you look at three aspects, and it's really a loop or a circle. You picture trigger, behavior, and result or reward. So you're really looking for each of these, a trigger, a behavior, and a result or reward. And I'll play a short video. Well, first I'll show you I'm just going to share that. It's a diagram. So that's that's an example, a diagram of the habit loop, and this comes from Mind Over Munch. So it's a group that deals with food and eating habit loops. So the trigger is the stimulus that prompts you to take action. The behavior is, the behavior is the action that itself that arises, and then the reward or the result is what perpetuates the cycle. So, we could see how, lying in bed, not being able to sleep, the behavior is worrying thoughts, and you keep spinning in the worrying thoughts, and the result is the anxiety. So that's this first step. That's all we want to do, is become familiar with all these loops, anxiety, as they relate to anxiety. I'll play a short clip as well that will describe it in different words.
Let's focus.
Let me just share that. Okay.
Specifically on how habits around anxiety are formed. We'll call it the habit loop. First, something happens in your life. It could be good or bad. It's called a trigger. For example, what does it feel like when something good happens in your life? Let's use getting a funny text or watching a cute video on your phone as an example. Your brain says, "Oh, that feels good. Do that some more," so you can keep that good feeling going. So your brain lays down this memory. Oh, next time you want to feel good, you should do that again. Now you start to associate that behavior with feeling good. The next time you hear that alert on your phone, that triggers your brain to act. Oh, I should check my phone. The more you do this, getting an alert on your phone, leading you to watch a cute video, leading you to feel good, the more this gets laid down as a habit loop. Trigger, behavior, reward. This works with negative emotions too. Have you ever just thought about how far behind you are on your to-do list? Or beaten yourself up for making a mistake or missing a deadline at school or work? How does that feel? Not so good, is it? Just like we want to have more good feelings, we want bad feelings to go away as quickly as possible. So what do we do when this happens? We get triggered by that thought or emotion and go and do something on our phones to feel better. This too lays down a memory. If you're stressed or anxious, distract yourself. You'll feel better. The more we do this, get anxious, which leads to distracting ourselves, which leads to feeling a little bit better, the more this too becomes a habit. Trigger, behavior, reward. Now, do you have stress or anxiety that seems to trigger more anxiety, feeding on itself? This might become its own type of habit loop. For example, you think of all the things you have to do today. Then you start to worry that you can't possibly get everything done. And that stressful thought triggers more worry thoughts. This goes on and on as you tighten down into a tiny ball of anxiety. In this case, stress itself can easily become a trigger for out-of-control anxiety. Instead of stress triggering us to get our to-do list done so we feel better, it triggers out-of-control worry thinking. Getting caught up in worry thinking becomes the new behavior in the habit loop. The result? We contract down into that tight little ball of anxiety. That's not much of a reward, is it? So there can be two types of habit loops that can be happening here. The one in which the behavior of doing something, like distracting ourselves, can make us feel a little bit better, and the one where the behavior is out of control thinking that just gets us all knotted up in a ball of anxiety. No matter which habit loop it is, what's tricky is that the more you get caught up in these behaviors, the more automatic they become. Over time, you're not even consciously choosing these actions anymore. It's like you're on autopilot. You're not even flying the plane.
Okay. So I hope that gives you an idea of what we're exploring here. That's really the step one, is is understanding those habit loops and how we can map them out. So you can really, when with present moment awareness, start to see how what your habit loops are. So one I noticed over the week was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 4:30, and that to 4 to 5, boredom would arise. And my habit was I'd grab a beer out of the fridge and I'd sit down and I'd watch the news. And then I realized that I've noticed that was actually making me feel more anxious, right? Because I'm watching all this mostly COVID related news. I really didn't need a beer at 4 in the afternoon. And so I noticed this habit loop that was actually causing me to have more anxiety. It wasn't helping me in any way, but I was doing it with the goal of feeling better, right? So the bigger and better offer that I made was I'll do something else. That when the boredom arises, when the trigger, which is the boredom arises, the new behavior will be I'll go and do 30 minutes of yoga. And I even picked the yoga teacher that I would watch online on YouTube, and would do the 30 minutes of yoga. And then I noticed, after I did that, I actually feel calm and relaxed. And the body feels loose, and the boredom's dissipated because the yoga was fun and interesting. So that became the bigger and better offer, was the calm and the good feeling that I had after doing the yoga. And as I continue to do that, that will create a new habit loop. So that's one that I noticed in my life. So you could say the more rewarding the behavior, the stronger that the habit will be, right? And this goes back to our early brains, or the way we try to get food with more calories so that we'll survive. So your brains see, and this is how my brain still works, sees chocolate cake and goes, "Oh, awesome." Big calories. I don't say that, but that's kind of what the big calories, chocolate cake. So we develop a preference for chocolate cake over turnips or salad, right? And this is how the habit would develop. And this same kind of thinking transfers to people and things. So everything gets this kind of reward value and triggers habits, and it becomes automatic. And that's why it's the reason why it's so hard to break habits. And we can't break them through sheer willpower. That's why that's why the Buddha explored, dealing with the habits that lead to dukkha in new ways. He didn't just say, force yourself to overcome craving. He looked, it was a practice to see that craving, what the results of craving are and clinging, and to see what the results of the abandonment of craving and clinging are. And in this way, we create new ways of being in the world. So in other words, we can't use willpower. We can't think our way out of it. We can access it through our felt experience of the behavior. And I'll go into this again, and we're getting into future weeks, really getting into the felt experience. So we can't tell ourselves to stop worrying. Right? Have you ever tried that? It doesn't work. You could have that be in that worrying, anxiety, stress, worry, anxiety loop. And you can say, okay, stop it. And of course, it's a habit loop that just continues. We tell ourselves to stop smoking. If it was simply willpower. So to change a habit, and we'll get to this in later weeks, we need to change the reward, change that loop in some way. Like the the beer in the news example that I gave. That one is very real because it just happened this week. And of course, this can apply to any harmful behavior, not just anxiety habit loops. We're discussing it here in the context of anxiety, but could apply to any what we would consider harmful habits. So I'll stop there and I'll open it for any questions.